Today, the bank's Porkies make them squeal. Howdy, Dennis Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Well, notice post covering finance and property news. Today, I'm joined again by Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, Martin.
So it was a fun week last week, and the banks got into a bit of trouble, didn't they?
Did they ever? What happened in Parliament on Wednesday at the Canberra hearing of the bank, the branch closures, regional branch closures inquiry, was something to behold. It was a pleasure to sit there. One of the best days I've ever had in that building, frankly, to be there when the senators went to bat against those bank CEOs. It was great. When we spoke last week, because you and I talked a week ago before this began, I had no idea. I had no premonition how good the week would be. So for all those people that are in tune and paying attention to the big issues around banking and the war on cash and those sort of issues that this all comes under the rubric of, be happy at the way things transpired this week. We are seeing an extraordinary process play out here in Australia, and the banks are firmly in the senators' sights.
Yeah, and I watched it in replay, and the whole thing is there, and it went on through the day on Tuesday. And the thing that I found fascinating was all of the stuff that we've been pointing at, the disequilibrium between what the banks have been saying about what's going on, what's really going on, and the fact that regional communities are being messed over, and the banks really have no response. The fact that the data that they're actually throwing out to try and justify their position just doesn't stand up. And then towards the end of the day, we basically had the Australian Bankers Association trying to sort of argue the impossible. I must say, kudos to the senators. They really have got this now. And what I find fascinating, Robbie, is that the dial has moved, bearing in mind that we've always held the view that, the banks and Parliament were on the same side of the fence against everybody else. Well, suddenly the senators are really, they're chucking big rocks and they're asking really, really important questions.
Well, Martin, you and I have been talking about 5 or 6 years now, doing shows together. One of the things that, if I've said it once on your show, I've said it 100 times, it's never made sense to me why the politicians have always seemed to be in the pockets of the banks, because at the end of the day, they've got to be elected by the people, not the banks. And you'll never lose votes by taking on the banks. And I'm thinking, why don't you get this? Well, finally, we're seeing a process where a number of senators who happen to be part of this committee and attached to it, like Senator Roberts, they have responded to some pointed lobbying by us, by you, by Dale Webster, the independent journalist, by me, by the communities that we were working with. And one of those was the town of Junee, and they had a hearing this week, and it was a real pleasure to be there and meet those people. But we were working with a number of communities, Coober Pedy in South Australia, Carnarvon in Western Australia, and we were representing to the senators what was going on here, right? And finally, we got the attention of some key senators, and that included, it was led by Senator Jared Rennick, Senator Matt Canavan, who happens to chair this particular committee, responded to the issue. A number of other significant Liberals came on board as well, and that was significant. And we got the inquiry up. So we did a lot of work to do that. That was a year ago. Remember, we were scrambling to get something like this inquiry up, and then it came to fruition in February. And now our friend Dale Webster has just drafted her article, which is sort of summarising the week that we're going to talk about now. But she makes the point in that these senators have learned from the process. They've now gone through 8 hearings. from the towns, listening to the evidence from the towns that the banks have abandoned, and they've definitely learned something. They've grown in stature, and they brought to the hearing with the banks in Canberra all their firepower and the courage of their convictions, if I can say it that way. They knew what they were talking about because they have eyeballed these communities, and they know there's a gulf between how the bankers are claiming the financial system works and how their victims in these communities that they're abandoning experience it, right? And so that sense of certainty that the senators had in taking on the banks, it made for a very powerful hearing. They did not pull their punches at all. And I think, and we're going to talk about a few things tonight, and we'll also play some clips. I don't want to waffle on all night because I want people to get a bit of a direct flavour of this. But I want to make this point, Martin. I think that part of it is the most significant of all, changing the outlook of the people who are our elected representatives in Parliament so that they know that these corporations, these banks, are not telling the truth. And they, as the representatives of the people who have the authority of Parliament, which is the only power greater than the banks, that's the key thing here, the only power greater than the banks, they are in a position to do something about it. And that's a shift in power dynamic, because until now, the banks have been running rings around the members of Parliament and making sure that the more powerful members of Parliament are very much in their camp, because banks are very powerful and they've got lots of resources, etc. They're the biggest lobbying force in Parliament, and they haven't had to worry about the power of Parliament being used against them. Now I think they do have to worry about it, because that was put to them all day on Wednesday, and it was a very significant psychological shift. So something big's happening in this, and it's going to have lots of ramifications for all these other issues, including the questions of where are we going to be forced into a digital dystopia? Are they going to take away our cash, etc.? All of that is on the line because of the power of this inquiry process that we've initiated.
Yeah, and it is just worth, I think, pausing to think that this is probably the most influential force in and against banking that we've ever seen, right? So the Royal Commission didn't really do much. It sort of went through the motions and produced a report that didn't go very far at all. But this is completely different. The reason it's different, Robbie, is its roots up. It's local communities realising they have a voice, realising that they actually can make a difference. And for me, that's really, really important, because this is about democracy in action. This is about real people getting involved in the process and seeing it actually come up and actually really hit the banks actually between the eyes here, right? And it's asking some really critical questions about, so what are our banks for? What's the relationship between the banks and the communities? To what extent are they actually just running their own agenda rather than actually supporting the community? And standing back, the bottom line is this: the banks in Australia get massive amounts of support from us, the taxpayers, via the government, via the RBA. What do we get in return? And for me, that actually is what the question has become now.
Well, exactly. So let's play some, before we play some clips, I just want to give a quick précis of the week. There were 3 hearings. The first was in Launceston, and that covered the northern part of Tasmania, and Tasmania has had a lot of bank branch closures. So that was another one where the community got to have their say. The second was in Canberra the next day, and I was with one of my colleagues, Glenn Isherwood, and we were buzzing around, travelling everywhere, getting hire cars, and it was plane, trains and automobiles, except the trains, I can tell you. A lot of travelling last week. So the Canberra hearing was with the bank CEOs and the Australian Banking Association and a few others. And then on Thursday was the town of Junee. And I want to, because we're going to talk about the bank CEOs quite a bit, I just want to make the point about Junee now, Martin, because I think, I really have deep respect for this town. I was already very admiring of what Junee did in the fight, the quality of fight they put up, which is what got the media attention, which is what got this inquiry. And I've been giving them credit all year. I got to go visit the town, and it blew me away. Because I'd gone to Carnama, where they'd lost their only Westpac back in February. That's the town in WA. Because Junee is only a one-bank town, I was expecting a similar town to Carnama. And you describe Carnama as a sleepy, dusty town, the type of town that would only have one bank. Junee is anything. Now, that's not a slight on Carnama. It's just what, places in remote Western Australia can be like. Junee is not that. Junee is a very, very different place. And plus the Riverina, especially right now, it's because there's no drought and whatever. It's lovely, green, rolling green hills, just absolutely beautiful, postcard perfect place. But the town is a vibrant, happening town. And I'm thinking, this town has only one bank and they were in danger of losing it, right? That's extraordinary. And then for the hearing, that town displayed its community spirit. They turned up in force. I mean, we don't have time to play clips of that, but you might be able to put up some of the footage in the background. When they had the opening, the whole room was packed. It's the most packed hearing so far. All the hearings have been pretty well attended. Nothing like Carnama. The town turned up in force, and then at the end of the hearing, they had the regular open mic session, and about 10 people from the town. There's usually about 2 or 3. 10 people from the town spoke at the open mic session. This is a town with great community spirit, and they're fighting hard. But I have to say, on top of that, it's not just they have the community spirit, the contributions of the townsfolk to the inquiry at the hearing, like in the form of their opening statements, these were high quality, high caliber opening statements. And I'll single out the CEO, James Davis. His opening statement was one of the best I've heard, mainly because he got to tell the story of the fight, Junee's fight against the Commonwealth Bank. And because they fought so hard, there was a lot to tell, including going through everything they did with things like going through the official processes of things like AFCA, right, the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, and how that went nowhere, etc. So he told all that story. It was a brilliant opening statement. Jackie Stevens was another one, a woman who's from the Junee Community Centre. She was dynamite, absolute dynamite in her opening statement. And in the afternoon, they had the chocolate factory owner, Neil Druce, and he told me all these things. In fact, I'm going to put some of them up as opening statements on YouTube, just so they're there for people to easily see, because they're kind of lengthy, the opening statements. We won't play them today. But his opening statement as a businessman in the town was very, very high quality, right? So I thought as given that you had 2 high quality hearings from affected communities, and sandwiched in the middle was the banks on the Wednesday, it was a perfect picture, absolute perfect picture. And the senators on the Thursday in Junee, they almost got to sit back and not do very much. The town did everything. The town did all the talking, right? And it was really, really great to see. And the breaking news, because we'll fill in the details, but and I think you've already noticed this yourself. We already knew that we had some of the banks on the run in this inquiry already. But the big news of the day, if you want to single out one thing that shows you the quality of this process, was on the Wednesday hearing in Parliament, the Commonwealth Bank announced something quite significant. Now, when I say this, people are going to have a skeptical reaction, and that you deserve to have a skeptical reaction, because you cannot trust a bank, of course. But understand that this is not just normal PR. This is an announcement under duress. So Matt Common of the Commonwealth Bank announced that the 3-year moratorium that they had put on regional branch closures a few months ago, there's a specific purpose to it. They are exploring the idea that they will break off from the herd and be the branch bank of Australia. That is what he said. Now, he then put lots of caveats on it, which will give them an out if they decide that isn't working. And one of them was it's sort of almost victim blaming in a sense. He wants the public to prove they want bank branches by switching their accounts to the Commonwealth Bank when the Commonwealth Bank is the bank in town. And he complained about how notoriously sticky bank customers are. So if they'll say in the future, in 3 years in the future, that hasn't been done sufficiently, and that's a possibility. So, of course, don't get too excited, but don't be too cynical either, because none of this was going to happen before February this year when we succeeded in getting this inquiry up. They had no intention to do any of this. And so that in that context, what Matt Common announced is significant. I've been on radio all year in interviews, and one of my points I kept saying is, if there's bank competition in this country, why hasn't one of the big four broken off from the herd and said, we will be the branch bank? That's what Matt Common said they're going to use the next 3 years to explore being that, right? So finally. And then the next day in June, it wasn't on the program, but the Commonwealth Bank regional manager turned up to announce that the bank was going to increase its trading hours from 3 days a week to 5 days a week. And he did that in front of the whole townspeople, and you can see the excitement in the background of the footage when he makes that announcement. And that's the Commonwealth Bank sucking up. You got the biggest, most powerful bank and most profitable bank in Australia sucking up to a town, a shire of 6,000 people in the middle of New South Wales, because that shire of Little Davids has taken down that Goliath in this forum. They got this inquiry up, and Commonwealth Bank has gone crawl into that town to try and make up for the damage they've done to their reputation. And the town is willing to embrace them if the Commonwealth Bank shows it's trustworthy, right? But you don't often see the Commonwealth Bank crawling to a town. That's what happened this week. And I think everyone who's been involved in this process should give yourself a pat in the back and take pride in the work we put in to push them down this path. We're nowhere near finished yet, but it's a really good sign of progress for what's been, an exceptional inquiry so far.
Yeah, and just to underscore, Juni wouldn't still have their branch without this process, right? We wouldn't have actually had the slowing of the closures amongst some banks, but not all banks, as we'll come on to. But more importantly, the atmospherics have changed completely, right? This is now right in the forecourt of the banks, right at the centre of the discussion. And the banks now know, right, that they are not going to get away with it. And that's the critical thing. So the reactions that we've forced are actually in response to overwhelming force. Yep.
All right, so for the sake of the video, let's go through these clips, because I'd like to use pretty much all of them, but I'll leave it to you, Martin, to trim them for time, of course. But I just want to give some of the dynamic, and we can't capture all of it, but I want to give some of the dynamic from the Wednesday hearing, because I think it was important. Now, you mentioned earlier the number one point, I think, which when everyone understands this, they get why in principle, we have to push so hard. And I was just having discussions with relatives today about this. Why should we make the banks do things that they don't consider in their interests, in their commercial interests, their private businesses? Well, of course, these four are particularly special private businesses. They're not like other private businesses. And so let's play a clip where Matt Common, at the opening part of the hearing, the CEO of CBA, he's talking about things like cash, and he uses a term to describe the Now, he claims all the banks did all day, which is good. They claim they're all committed to cash, which is good. But he then gives an insight in the way the banks think about it, and he uses a term, cross-subsidisation. So listen to Matt Common and the way he explains cash and uses this term cross-subsidisation.
I think you summed it up well. There's a level of cross-subsidisation that occurs in any business.
Yeah.
Some of that cross-subsidisation in the past, I think, has been providing services, if you like, to a local community that you wouldn't necessarily charge for, but were important for local communities. A lot of it just goes with social interaction, support for local community organisations. Some of it also is for support and identification of successful businesses. Mm-hmm. And I think what people really worry about is, okay, if they've got an existing account and existing loans, they'll probably stay there because they're happy. But the problem in the future is, how is the young farmer, the young person wanting to start a business, going to establish a personal relationship that lets a bank back them see their success and see them grow. When you call up on the phone or the internet, it's really, really hard to establish your bona fides in that way. How are you going to respond to those challenges, do you think, going forward when we move to this more impersonal, distant interaction with people and still service local communities who will not be able to have face-to-face contact with their bankers?
That's right. But look, I mean, both the specifics and the sentiment of what you're expressing, I completely agree with. And we'll need to be able to serve our customers in remote and regional areas for an extended period of time. And the example that you're giving, I've seen plenty of customers like that over time. And frankly, building that relationship and understanding what their plans are and how they're thinking about it is a conversation that is clearly much better had in person. Now, there's some parts of that relationship that you can maintain and manage remotely over time. But I think certainly for the foreseeable future, face-to-face services will be important. And I'd say a couple of things. One, I mean, as the function of any competitive market, there's different financial institutions that make different choices. Frankly, some of the customers that we serve, other banks would choose not to. They don't have a presence. They won't offer the services that we do, and that's fine. We have a very different, in my view, mandate, history, role as the Commonwealth Bank. And we have to get that balance right. We have to remember the history of why we were created in Act of Parliament in December 1911, what we stand and who we're here to serve for. We also have to make sure that we're not allowing or seeing too many or too large across subsidies be generated over time. Of course, we want to maintain competitiveness in all of those markets, do a great job for our customers, but also make a sustainable return for owners who are prepared to put their investment in the Commonwealth Bank, which we have the benefit of being very widely held in Australia, and we're talking about 12 million Australians.
Yeah, and the point there, Robbie, of course, is that it's a very convenient excuse, right? A very convenient excuse indeed, when in fact they actually get massive subsidisation from the government, and the accounting processes that the banks are using are deliberately designed to make branches unprofitable.
And that came out in Junee big time, because a lot of the businesses in Junee know that their accounts have been moved to Wagga Wagga. The BSBs at Wagga Wagga, they know that it's deliberately making the Junee branch look bad. So that's reverse. What's the opposite of subsidise? Like that's reverse subsidisation, right? That's Junee subsidising the Wagga Wagga branch.
It's deliberate accounting. Just to be clear, it's deliberate accounting to make branches look like loss leaders. By the way, that's exactly what Australia Post is doing too, right? It's a deliberate strategy that corporations use when they want to jettison stuff. It's an accounting trick.
So Senator Gerard Rennick, who before he was a senator was a treasury accountant at a major bank, not one of the big four, but the Bank of Queensland, so a big enough bank. So he understands the accounting that goes on inside banks. He was treasury accountant. He took on Matt Common on this word cross-subsidisation. Now, I don't want to... There's a longer clip which we can't play. People can the clips we're using tonight. Can I say I'll do a little bit of plug for my show, Martin? So we're using clips tonight on this program that we did that are different to the ones that we used on the Citizens Party Citizen Report this week. So if you go to the Citizens Report on YouTube, you can see some long clips from that Elisa Barwick and Craig Isherwood presented from the hearing, and they're sort of in a longer form. And one of those captures Gerard Rennick taking up this question of cross-subsidisation. But I want to play this really short fragment of it where he rounds on Common and makes the point that you've just made. Hang on, you're propped up by the taxpayer, you're subsidised. And listen to Common's reaction to that.
We had $51 billion of the term funding facility. It doesn't quite work the way that you characterise. Effectively, all of that fixed is actually hedged into floating. one of the reasons why banks do that is to manage interest rate risk. We don't want to end up in a situation.
Treasury account.
And if you think about the dollars, just maybe to help illustrate it, that $51 billion, we have $96 billion of fixed rate home loans maturing this year.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the economics and the differential, just the calculation doesn't work.
But regardless, though, you were subsidised. The major banks were subsidised. That's the bottom line, whether you like it or not. And there was a backstop.
I don't understand how it's a subsidy. The Reserve Bank here and many other central banks did.
Because the Reserve Bank ended up making a loss that we'll have to pay for.
Because those bonds were marked to market against a rising interest rate environment.
Yeah.
There was a funding facility that was made available to stimulate growth.
Yeah, but the taxpayer picks up the tab.
Yeah, basically, he doesn't see the same as we see, right?
What subsidy? I don't know how you can call this a subsidy. I mean, $188 billion from the term funding facility. That's what Senator Rennick was referring to, that of which Commonwealth Bank got $51 billion of that. They borrowed at 0.1%. They're lending out at commercial rates or lending back to the RBA at 4.1%. That's not a subsidy. So, Martin, just to settle this, in case people are wondering if it's just a question of definition, let's go back a few months to play the clip from November last year where Senator Rennick took on the RBA about this question, the Reserve Bank in the Senate estimates about this question of the term funding facility. And look how the RBA describes the term funding facility and what it is for the banks.
Look, my first question is in regards to the term funding facility and just what the terms of that funding facility is. Is it about the outstanding balance? I think is about 188 billion, and is that money that the banks have lent at a fixed rate when it was taken out, or is that move in line with the RBA cash rate?
That money can be lent by banks or used by banks for a whole range of purposes. So some of it might have found its way into fixed rate loans.
No, but when they borrowed it from you,
when they borrowed it from us,
RBA, what's the rate of interest they're paying?
It's fixed. Some of it was fixed at the earlier rate it was taken out at, which is 25 basis points.
Right.
And much of it's fixed at 10 basis points.
Right. So they're borrowing at 0.1 or 0.15, and they're now lending out that money at the various market rates.
Yeah.
Could be anywhere between the overnight cash rate of 3.3% now, 3.25% now, up to 5 or 6%.
Yep, something like that. Yeah.
So in regards to when they park it with the RBA, the overnight cash rate, they're getting about a 3% margin on that. The same money that you've lent to them, they now lend back to you, and that's basically a free gift to the banks, isn't it, on behalf of the Australian taxpayer?
Well,
I mean, it is a subsidy. It was intended to be because it was put in place, as the Deputy Governor suggested, during those dire times of March 2020, when the intention was to provide low-cost funding, and much of that low-cost funding was passed on to borrowers, including households, but also small businesses, in the form of low-rate loans.
Okay, thank you. So any money that's parked overnight, though, the RBA cash facility isn't actually being passed on, is it?
No.
They're actually creaming 3% off the top. I mean, they're borrowing at 0.1 and then they're making a 3% margin, so that's something like a 3,000%
yes,
return.
but I suspect much of it was lent out.
Well, yeah.
And earning an even higher return for the banks.
That's something I think that, the banks should actually, in my view, be made repaid, because I fail to see why they should be getting, money at 0.1% while, hard-working Australians are now, copping it on the chin in regards to their home loans. Anyway, I'll leave that as a statement.
Subsidy is a subsidy is a subsidy. The only people who don't think it's a subsidy are the beneficiaries of the subsidy. But I know we have to be really careful about cross-subsidising something like cash provision services. We're really careful about that, right? Anyway, I thought that was just a beautiful example of the kind of penetration the senators are getting with these questions now and getting under their skin.
Robbie, just one quick point. On the term funding facility, of course, interest rates were very low. Now interest rates have gone up dramatically. So the costs to society of the term funding facility program has gone through the roof. Who's paying for it? We, the taxpayer. are paying for it, and the
100%.
banks are getting the benefits.
Well, because as in the longer clip, as Senator Rennick and Matt Canavan actually said, well, the RBA has made a big loss through that term funding facility that the taxpayer picks up the tab for. Now, that's as it should be, because the RBA is actually our national bank. That's how national banks can work. They're backed up by the wealth of the public, right? And they have actually flexibility and latitude to do these things. And all we're arguing, Martin, is that should be used for the good of the country, for everybody, like invest in infrastructure and those sort of things. But anyway, in the case of the term funding facility, that's just the way it works. We're paying for that, and the banks are like, what subsidy? Now that said, it was particularly good to see, despite that the announcement Common made. I haven't damned Common yet, but he did make a bad announcement at the same time, which was that Bank West, the subsidiary, the 100% subsidiary of Commonwealth Bank in Western Australia, which isn't covered by the Commonwealth Bank's moratorium on regional branch closures. And he explained that the reason why is because Bank West intends to go fully digital. So this was actually breaking news from the inquiry, and I'm flabbergasted. So I'm glad, over here we have what the Commonwealth Bank said about it's going to try and be the branch bank as Commonwealth Bank, branded Commonwealth Bank. But by the same token, it's subsidiary in WA, and WA of all places. These are vast distances between towns. Internet connectivity is bad everywhere in Australia. It's as bad in WA, worse than most places. But the idea that Bank West can be a fully digital bank, just in practical terms, is ridiculous. Yet that's what they're pushing ahead and doing. And CBA, the parent, is pretending they're taking a hands-off approach. I suspect it's an experiment, like Macquarie Bank has been put up to do an experiment of a fully digital bank. And in a sense, it's to help normalise the idea, right? And the customers of Bank West should be reacting very, very angrily now that if you've heard it here, get the word around. Object in the strongest terms. There is no justification for these banks like Bank West going fully digital in Australia, but there it is. Now, I want to play, Martin. There's a whole bunch of things we could do, but just for the sake of time, I want to single out just a few little things, and then we're going to get to a long theme that I think people really need to see. Have a look at. I just want to play this clip of Matt Canavan talking to Shane Elliott from ANZ. And this is, to me, it was particularly funny. It was a laugh out loud moment in the hearing, because before what you see, Shane Elliott had been saying a few times, he would like who me, hand on heart, we're not doing this to slide our customers. And he said, if he said it once, he said it 20 times. I would like nothing more than for our customers to use our branches. Nobody's using them. That's why we're closing them. And in the 7 years Shane Elliott's been in charge, the number of ANZ branches has gone from 750 down to 380 or 390 or something like that, right? And he has slayed their branch network. And he was actually used as an excuse the fact that the retail side of ANZ in Australia is about half the size of CBA. He said we're closer to Bendigo Bank in size than CBA, which is a much bigger bank. And so he was basically saying we can't be held to the same standard. But of course, ANZ as an overall entity, all these banks are a little bit different in different ways. They have different histories and whatever. Of course, the CBA was a public bank once, right? That's why it's structured slightly differently. But ANZ, as the overall entity, ANZ is one of the big four for sure. It's a huge bank. It's got a bigger international presence than the other banks. But it's still, so collectively though, it's one big bank. It's a massive bank, and they were happy in years gone by, decades gone by, to have a huge branch network in Australia. Right? He's just now trying to hide behind this, we're smaller, don't hold us to the same account. But he kept saying, we would like nothing more than for our customers to use our branches. And so Matt Canavan, the chair of the inquiry, had this line of questioning for him.
try and rush through quickly to wrap things up. We've heard evidence, Mr. Elliott, that bank staff are coached or directed to encourage customers towards digital alternatives, to sort of not use the in-branch services. Does your staff get it any way directed in that fashion?
Well, they certainly don't get. I heard earlier today the inference that they have some sort of targets or get incentivised to do so. Absolutely, they do not. Our staff are encouraged to make sure that customers understand the alternatives and know how to use an ATM in the event that that's all that's available in terms of over weekends or out of hours. But there's certainly no performance push that
wasn't my question though. But are they sort of encouraged? So hey, just make sure you let people know they could do this online or make a call.
And we think that's a responsible thing to do. To make
how is that consistent? Earlier today, though, you said that you'd love for more people to come into your branch. You'd love people to use the branch. How's that consistent with your claim that you'd love that, but you're actually encouraging your staff to get people to go online?
Oh no, that's a fair question. I mean, again, it goes back to what I think Kaz's point. There are two things that happen in a branch. One is very transactional, and look, I don't know that people want to stand in a queue or wait just to make a deposit. And so we're saying, hey, we want people to know there are alternatives. We think those alternatives are safer, faster, and better for many, not for everybody. And so we just want them to know how to do that stuff. So that's fine. So that branch can actually do the other part of their job, which is probably more valuable and what people really value, which is a conversation.
And Martin, that was my laugh out loud moment. I was because I can see that. I can see how that's a good question. Yeah, you're actively telling your staff, do everything you can to get the customers out of the branch. We know that because the staff have told us. That's all come out of this hearing, and yet you're pretending, we would like nothing more than our customers to use our branches. Absolute utter rubbish. So that's the sort of stuff to see that, and that's not scripted, that kind of exchange, right? That's the chairman of the inquiry thinking on his feet, because they're so well versed in this issue now, because they've looked at it all year in a very sincere way, and they've seen the issue through the eyes of the bank customers.
Yes, and it's just worth, I think, underscoring again how far those senators have moved along the learning journey, right? I can remember, was it last October, November time, I recorded a show with Senator Rennick on my channel, and I raised this issue, and it was clear that at that stage he was only vaguely aware of it as an issue. So, the learning journey that these senators have gone through is brilliant, and it shows, the power of democracy. But you've got to get them started on the road, and, we're able to give them a shove. And now they're really gaining momentum on their own behalf.
No, of course. And in a more general point, which, again, you and I have discussed on your channel many times over the years, one of the powers of what we do here is engaging normal citizens in the democratic process, in the policy process. That's why, how many times, Martin, have you and I done shows about Senate inquiries?
Yep.
and there's so many over the years, it can seem almost a bit boring, another Senate inquiry. But that's where the laws everyone's complaining about are made in that building.
Yep.
And they're voted on by these people that are called senators and members, right? And a big chunk of the problem is the public vacating the field out of their cynicism. These people are a waste of time. There are processes through which you can engage in the process, in the policy process, formal processes like inquiries. Engage in them, because only it gives you a chance, an opportunity to tilt the playing field back in your favour, because you get the ear and the eyes of these senators, and they learn something. When they learn something, suddenly they're on fire, like we're seeing in this process. And my best example, if I can come to now, the main thing I wanted to highlight, to me, this is the most significant thing. I have a new political hero, and almost an unlikely accidental hero. I never thought I'd come into 2020. I mean, I don't want to overdo it. She'll probably think I'm a stalker. But can I say, Labor Senator Linda White is an absolute star. An absolute star. Now, I'm putting a premium on it because she is the one person in the inquiry from the Labor Party, and they're in government. So when this inquiry hands down its report, that party is in a position to do something about it. So her attitude towards this inquiry as the member of the committee is important. Man, is she playing an important role in this inquiry. And she, in many cases, I mean, people like Matt Canavan is a great leader because he's the chair. Senator Jared Rennick has done a brilliant job in actually pushing for this thing and getting it up and leading the hearings and really going after the banks. But what Linda White does, and especially what she did on Wednesday to the banks and then to the Banking Association, is something to see. And there's lots of exchanges. I wish I could play them all, but I want to play a bunch of clips in a row, and these are slightly longer than the clips we've played so far. But I want you to see the consistency of what she did all day. And the bottom line is this. Right now, I mean, Matt Common used this term, banks are heavily regulated. I mean, there's regulation, then there's penny ante red tape. I mean, there's lots of rubbish red tape out there. But fundamentally, they're not regulated. Australia's banks are self-regulated. They have a regulation from APRA, which is on capital requirements, right? That is APRA's role as the regulator for the banks on capital requirements, and so they have that. But in terms of things like how the banks are supposed to act, etc., and behave, they have a voluntary code of practice. And there's this never-ending debate in Australia about whether this thing's enforceable or not. And it's kind of a grey area. But bottom line, while it can be cited in court cases and whatever, in reality, the procedures that are there to enforce this, I mean, most of the time at worst, it comes down to this process of naming and shaming the banks if they contravene the code of practice. And frankly, that's just nothing. They don't care. But for all intents and purposes, this is voluntary self-regulation, and the banks want to keep it that way. And so what Linda White did is all day she went after that issue on the banks. And I think it's worth seeing the consistency of her questioning and her tone in asking those questions. And you'll see it in different ways. The banks are either in response to they're trying to be neutral, or they're actually uncomfortable. They don't want to come out absolutely caning it, the idea, but they absolutely do oppose this idea. So let's just play one at a time. This is her asking the question to Commonwealth Bank about the need for regulation. And because the Commonwealth Bank had just announced, Matt Common had just announced that they're going to try this to be the branch bank, she asked it in a certain way, and he had to sort of be agreeable. But just watch this.
So this is the issue of regional banking has been going. The problems have been highlighted in this parliament since 1999. There was the Hawker report over 2 years. There was the Making Money Matters in the bush in 2004. There was the Banking Task Force, and then there's currently our inquiry. And of course, we're grappling with looking at all of the things that have been said before, and most of the things that, in fact, everything that's been said before leaves it voluntarily to banks to do the right thing and not close. And consistently since 1999, that hasn't worked. Why wouldn't we consider a recommendation that ups the game and says, as part of your banking licence, you do have to maintain a regional presence? Given that you've said you're swapping tax, that wouldn't worry you at all then, would it? If that was a recommendation and the government decided to put on your banking licence some social licence and some responsibility to regional Australia, you'd be fine with that, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, we've already made the commitment in regional Australia. I do think it can't be lost in terms of the extent to which banking preferences have changed over time in both metropolitan and in regional areas. And of course, the distances can be much vaster in in regional areas, and the provision of digital infrastructure and services is extremely important.
So that's the first time she raised it, right? Okay. What if we actually put some requirements on your banking license here? And he had to sort of not, hold a poker face, not give too much away. But I can tell you insider saying, whoa, hang on, whoa, don't do that. But anyway, so you saw the reaction there. Look at her do the same thing now to Peter King from Westpac.
Sure.
Can I also just suggest to you one other thing, that there's been a series of reports about regional banking. There was the Hawker report that was 2 years in the making in 1999. There's the Money Matters in the Bush. There's the Banking Task Force report of 2021-22, and now there's our inquiry, all of which suggested that banks should stick with regional areas and be their better selves. That hasn't worked, really. It doesn't seem. So why wouldn't we as a committee recommend to the government that there should be something on your banking licences that represents your social licence to the regional areas? Would you have a problem with that? That was a recommendation that we made.
But if you look at the way, so I think we've got two things there. We've got how are the majority of customers banking, and then a transition issue. So if I mentioned before, I've had the opportunity to go out with our bankers and visit farmers and whatnot. I would say they're pretty happy with the service in general. But we wouldn't be here today unless some people are not. So the question to me is, what is the service, and then how do we deliver it in an efficient way? So one of the points I've been making is we understand, so if we take cash is important. Scale is also important in the delivery of cash, given the falling reliance in the economy of the use of cash, which is falling in regional as well as metro. So we've got to have sustainable models to deliver cash. Certainly we see Australia Post, which provides access to 80 ADIs, 3 majors, but a lot of ADIs as that opportunity. So I think you would need to think very carefully about what it is, what is the service, and what are the alternatives, and how do we service the need, which is changing over time.
So in your so that's a maybe. It'll be okay. Do I take it?
Well, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is.
Well, we might make you stay in regional area. We might suggest that your licence should say you have to have a significant footprint in regional areas, or you can't diminish it.
Would that be every ADI in Australia?
Might be. We're still thinking through it. But can I ask you? I'm asking you.
We're about to do the NAB one, and then you'll see ANZ later. One of the things that started coming out from NAB, from the Banking Association, then ANZ, is they let slip in their answers that they'd been listening to the rest of the hearing and reading transcripts from previous hearings. These are very important, busy CEOs. I know they're important and busy, right? They knew they had to be fully prepared for this hearing, right? So they're sitting there watching the other hearings all day, knowing that they're going to be in the hot seat next. So, and then Senator White didn't let up. Now, we'll play the NAB one. You're about to see her ask the same question to Ross McEwen. Ross McEwen, frankly, is an arrogant son of a bitch. And you can see it in his answer. In fact, he was the most, how would you say it? He was the least worried about the optics of looking annoyed and displeased by this inquiry. This is a guy who I think has looked down his nose at politicians all around the world. In New Zealand, where he started off as a banker, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, where he was the head of Royal Bank of Scotland for quite a few years, and then back in Australia. This guy is an arrogant son of a bitch who thinks our elected representatives serve him. He's not used to this, and his body language was showing it. And he was the one that was the most open about not being happy with this idea at all. What's the clip?
We've had the Hawker report in 1999, the Money Matters in the Bush Senate inquiry, the Banking Task Force, and now we've got our inquiry, all of which have recommendations that are very similar, which rely on the banks doing the right thing. We might consider putting on licences, recommending to the government putting on licences, banking licences, some need to maintain minimum numbers of branches in regional areas. Would that cause you a problem?
I'm just trying to think what the purpose of that would be, Senator, in a very changing, dynamic world. If you take yourself back 30 to 40 years, it was all done in a branch, and every branch was its own little bank. Today, that world is completely different. The vast majority of our customers are not doing it through a branch network in their transactions. So I would think that you need to consider, what are you trying to enshrine into Australia? Because it sounds like a world, you're enshrining a world that would never change. Well, it is changing dramatically.
So I'll tell you what hasn't changed, though, is every bank, major bank, still makes billions of dollars every year. That hasn't changed, has it?
No, but the way customers are requesting us to serve them has changed dramatically since I started in banking. And you must accept that when you look at the statistics. And you have a look at your own life with how often you would use a Zoom call, your internet, your mobile phone. Those services never were provided 40 years ago. We were lucky to have a contact centre. Now you've got a contact centre, online, mobile, you've got all of those services. So I'd be very careful before enshrining something of like a number of branches into a banking licence, particularly when we now have 3 times the number of branches we did at the peak of having branches using Australian Post and the services. So I think you need to think about this more as a point of presence as opposed to a physical manifestation of a branch.
And now, Martin, let's just play the final bank. Senator White asking ANZ the same question.
Because you've been following, you know my next question, I'm sure, and I'm sure you've got an answer for it. But we've had multiple inquiries into banks dating back to 1999 with the Hawker report, which was a 2-year inquiry. Then there's the Money Matters in the Bush, the Banking Task Force, and now we've got this inquiry. Every one of those inquiries has sort of suggested voluntary codes of conduct, or that the banks should be their best selves and consult properly and keep their footprint, and that they should have a social licence. Remarkably, since 1999, that's failed, really, because each of these reports has gone through it. Why wouldn't we make what do you say to the suggestion that we should make a recommendation that on your licences there should be a condition about maintaining a footprint and not just abandoning regional Australia?
Look, I understand that this is a difficult issue for the country, and I understand it's a very difficult issue for regional Australia, not just in banking and the provision of any service, and it's something that we grapple with. I think that such a provision would impose an unfair burden on those that are already in the regions and have done the right thing, as opposed to the 80 other organisations who compete in Australia who have no branch network. I mean, and I'm not really sure, if I go back to the beginning, the reason the branches are struggling in regional Australia is because customers aren't using them. I would love the fact that customers use our branches more, and that would be a good thing.
They don't like it, Robbie. They don't like it.
No, they absolutely don't like it. I referred before to this power dynamic, right? You and I, Martin, as individuals have no power over corporations. We're told there's this thing called the market, that somehow we are mysteriously part of the market, and the amorphous, undefined hive mind of the market can dictate to corporations. That's how we're told we have power. That's all rubbish. The reason we have the power we do have as individuals is through the political process. The Parliament does have the power over the banks. It's just that for 30 years or more, under the neoliberal ideology, we've had 2 or 3 generations of parliamentarians who've been brainwashed into an economic ideology that makes them believe they have no right to use that power over such corporations. And now we're seeing an already very powerful Senate inquiry expressing through a member of the sitting government, hang on, we might use this power we have over you. What do you think about that, hey? Now, so that's the 4 banks. But, Martin, the banks have a lobbyist. The banks have a court jester who they pay a lot of money to keep them entertained and to dance the halls of Parliament. And she is a piece of work. Her name is Anna Bligh. And she is something to behold, this person. So Anna Bligh is a former Labor Premier of Queensland. She's the woman who cried over the floods in Brisbane in 2010 or 2011 or whenever it was. Oh, the great Anna Bligh. And then her state threw her out on her ear at the next election because they didn't care she shed a tear over the floods because she tried to privatise half the state and they said, no way, no how, and they threw her out. But she's Labor, right? She's actually a Labor person, but somehow she's headed up a Labor person as the head of the Banking Association. If Ben Chifley and John Curtin were alive today, they would despise this person. Utterly despise her, to be honest. No true blue Labor person would ever have aspired to be the head of a banking association. The banks were the money power. The banks were the enemy. Anyway, so I'm going to play 2 clips of Anna Bligh, and both of them were in response to Linda White. And then think about the significance of that. Senator White is Labor. Anna Bligh is former Labor. Senator White did not back off on Anna Bligh. She went harder on Anna Bligh than she did on the banks. And Anna Bligh deserved every bit of her venom. And I want to play the clip that represents that. And this is just, how do I say it? Because I don't want to preempt the clip too much. But here's the thing. Senator White is trying to get Anna Bligh to acknowledge that the code of practice that the banks and the Banking Association wave around, and essentially the Banking Association is in charge of the code of practice, that the code of practice, as it's applied to these bank branch closures, has been very, very poor. And she used the example of Cloncurry. And I want to watch this clip and watch how Senator White raises Cloncurry. And she raises Bob Catter. And Anna Bligh's answer has nothing to do with the question. Anna Bligh gives an entirely catty answer, a politician's answer, the kind of answer you get from a politician who's in the hot seat, who's trying to deflect as a politician, a typical lying, scummy politician. She's not that. That's not her job anymore. It shouldn't be her job as a politician anyway, but we're used to it from politicians when they're combating the other side. This is not a politician trying to deflect political point scoring from the other side. This is an ex-Labor politician trying to deflect a genuine question from someone from her side, supposedly from her side, and just the answer encapsulates just her frame of mind and the utter contempt with which she held this process. Have a look.
Frankly. But do you think is that what your new code of conduct is, or whatever it's called, is going to suggest that, as long as it's 2 minutes before the press release goes out, that's great?
Well, I suppose it depends on who you think ought to be advising the rest of the community. I think the difference with some of the maybe experience you've had in the past is that, and I'm sorry, I don't know all of it, but I think it's fair to say that the decision to close a bank is something in which the whole community has a vital interest. Yeah. It's very different to making someone redundant in an organisation that nobody really knows about or uses. And so there is an obligation, I think, on the banks to make sure that their staff are the first to hear it, and that their staff don't hear it from the mayor or the journalist in town, but they hear it from their employer. And then there's an obligation for banks to let all of the other people who have a genuine interest know as soon as reasonably possible. And I think if the federal member heard it from a staff member and not from the manager, they wouldn't feel that they had been treated appropriately.
Well, interesting you say that, because in fact when Westpac changed its decision in relation to those 8 branches, one of which was in Cloncurry, those staff members didn't hear of the change of their employment from the bank. They heard it from the local federal MP, Mr Katter, and he also rang the FSU and told them. Do you think that's best practice? Not according to what you just said, it's not, is it?
I think it's a lot to ask for me to comment or to be responsible for anything that Mr Katter might do.
Well, sorry, somebody spoke to Mr Katter and told him beforehand. He knew beforehand. So the bank didn't prioritise their employees, they prioritised Mr Katter. So I'm saying to you that even with this task force's recommendation about better practices, I mean, this all happened pretty recently, but before your code of conduct was improved, it still went to the local member first. And he was the one that told the union and told the staff.
Well, as I said, I'm not privy to the actions of Mr Katter or the individual circumstances in this case. What I have said, and which I've heard all of the CEOs say this morning, and what I think is absolutely appropriate, is that staff should hear it from the organisation that employs them.
But I can point you, and there's other cases as well that we've heard from.
Just wow.
I couldn't. I nearly fell off my chair. Right, I thought it's and I'd love to give you the follow up if we had more time. But Senator White kept coming back at her because she wasn't being asked to justify Bob Katter or anything like that. It had nothing to do with it. It's just the fact that Bob Katter was the guy who notified the staff of that bank about their change of employment, not the bank. Westpac didn't notify him. Bob Katter did because he got the news first. That's all she was saying. And Anna Bligh chose to use, a politician because Bob Katter has a reputation in Australia, right? And it's just a sneering, arrogant contempt for this inquiry. But she said she displayed that attitude to the wrong person because Linda White went after her big time. And I want to play now Linda White questioning Anna Bligh about the code of practice and the question of it being mandatory, going from voluntary to mandatory and putting some actual requirements on the banks. And Anna Bligh felt she had to actually take this on big time on behalf of the people who pay her, the big four banks. And you can see in Anna Bligh's answer that, if the other banks were trying to sort of keep a poker face and not show how much they're displeased at this, you can see in her answer how utterly displeased that they are. Have a look.
The privilege to make billions of dollars from the Australian community. Why shouldn't there be a social licence for it?
Well, firstly, can I say in relation to your point about transparency, that was something that was discussed quite a bit in the previous process that was led by Michael Sukkar, and it's why one of the recommendations is that banks be required to put these assessments up so that the community can understand with more transparency what were the things that drove the decision. Now, as I said, maybe they could get better, but it's a lot more transparent and certainly will be in the future than it has ever been in the past. And I think I don't think it's surprising that any business that's looking at facing into the decision of whether or not to close one of its facilities, whether it's a bank or a hamburger shop or Centrelink office, these are tough decisions, and there will never be just one factor that drives it. It'll be the accumulated impact of a number of factors, and that's what I heard from all of those CEOs that you've spoken to this morning. But on the issue of whether or not you should attach a requirement to the licence to, have a certain number of branches, I can understand the temptation that this might present to the committee, and I would encourage the committee to consider a couple of things. Firstly, what would be the impact on Australia Post and its agencies if banks were required to keep branches open in towns where they had little or no usage? And in that regard, I would just remind you that Christine Holgate, the Australia Post CEO who negotiated those agreements, said in a committee that the agreement saved the Bank at Post service in around 3,000 community post offices across Australia. The service was threatened with closure as it was heavily loss-making. If the service had closed, the consequences would have been devastating for regional communities and many local post offices would have closed. I think it would be difficult to put an obligation to keep banks' branches open and to expect that those contracts would be renewed. So there's something to, I think, just take into account. And I certainly heard the previous witness, Mike Lawrence from COBA, pointing out the impact that it might have on some of the smaller banks that he represents. But I think the other
seriously, can I just say seriously, you cannot be serious to suggest that somehow it's a Save Australia Post strategy for banks to close in regional areas. That is what you're expecting us to kind of join up, and that is just a ridiculous thing to say. Seriously.
Well, it's not what I said, Senator. It's not what I said. You asked what might be the implications, and I'm saying at least one of them would be a decision at banks about, well, if we have forced to keep branches open that nobody is using, would we also pay Australia Post and its agencies? It's just one question, and if I were a member of the committee, I would certainly be asking Australia Post about that. It's only one issue. Secondly, I think you'd have to think about what the impact, and I agree with the point made by the CEO of NAB, trying to predict what banking will look like in Australia in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, if you think about the changes in the last decade, is an impossible task. And seeking to enshrine one channel that, is in rapid decline will have the effect of taking money out of innovation, security, cyber safety, where customers are actually banking. So I think it's really important to think about where those relative investments are. And then you might say, well, they make big profits, so why don't they just take it out of that? I think it's really important, and let's talk about profitability. If banks aren't making a net interest margin of around 2%, then their credit rating is at risk. And their credit rating determines the cost at which they can raise funds. So if we want to have an impact on banks' credit ratings, then just say hello to more expensive products for every Australian. So it's a very delicate balance, and it needs to be thought through in every single part of the system.
So we'll leave it there, Martin, in terms of Linda White. But, I mean, you see there, she was no holds barred all day, and she rose to the occasion, and she went for the jugular, especially for Anna Bly's jugular. Good on her. And the other, there's other exchanges too all day. I'd love to play them all. Like I said, you can go and see some more flavour in our show, The Citizens Report. But for the sake of time, we can't. Appreciate the people who support these campaigns, so that someone like me can go and sit in the room and participate and try and capture this for you and convey it as imperfectly as I am, but nevertheless give you a sense of the overall zeitgeist of what went on. But I hope you've seen there I have a sense of the power of what these senators, including the sitting Labor government senator Linda White, brought to these hearings. I can tell you now, these banks are extremely uncomfortable. They would be having damage control meetings right now, like Commonwealth Bank clearly has been doing for a while, and Commonwealth Bank's decided to get ahead of the process. They would absolutely be in damage control. There was a really good article in the Financial Review about this week that, in fact, Dale Webster, who has documented this as a journalist more than anybody. One of her sort of complaints is that when the normal mass mainstream media comes along and reports on this stuff, the journalists are never that well informed, and so they never they never do a good enough job, right? She was actually highly complimentary of the Financial Review's article, and it quoted me quite a bit because I had a lengthy chat with the journalist when I was in Juni, actually, James Ayres, and he quoted me quite a bit. And I'm thinking, I even got to the point thinking, well, probably Anna Bly has got people looking me up on LinkedIn or whatever by now to wonder what the hell has happened. This little process they thought they could ignore probably at the beginning has absolutely blown up in their face. And if they're reading the room, they should be absolutely panicking and really trying to find out, is Linda White speaking on behalf of the Labor government when she's going after them? Or has she gone off the reservation and just doing this as a caring senator, having responded to the inquiry and speaking on behalf of constituents? Because if there's any sense that she actually might be speaking on behalf of the Labor government because she is a Labor senator, these banks should be very, very worried, and they should be worried anyway because this inquiry is not over by any means. In fact, it's been extended until May now. It was going to wrap up in December. It's been extended until May because the senators have got a taste for it, and now they're determined to go to all the states, and so they're making time for a lengthy series of hearings in South Australia, and the banks are just going to cop it more and more and more, and I'm sure they're in damage control trying to figure out what the hell to do.
Yeah, and just two quick observations from me. One of the things that really stood out was NAB when they were asked about their numbers. You may remember that a couple of months ago they gave evidence to say they weren't actually counting transactions that weren't actually just cash transactions, and that was a big issue. Well, they tried to sort of skirt around it unsuccessfully, and it was amazing just watching them wriggle as the senators pushed them on the numbers, and they really didn't want to admit that they didn't really have all the data, but they still actually had to admit they didn't have all the data. But the other one was that, as the discussion went on, there was, what are the solutions? Is the solution going to be to apply regulatory pressure to the banks, or do they create a new competitor, a national bank, which could actually turn the volume up in terms of competition? And I suspect that those other banks now are thinking, oh wow, actually this could actually be quite serious in terms of the competitive landscape for banking in Australia. About time too, some would say. So these are really, really important developing issues, and I'm so glad that the senators have extended to get more input from the community, but also to think through what the solutions need to be to stop this. And for me, that's a really encouraging sign.
Yep, and the Financial Review covered that aspect of it at the end of the article. It was Senator Malcolm Roberts who took on Anna Bligh over the question of a national bank. Her answer was completely disgusting. Yep. She really earned her stripes as as PR for the private
Only
bank.
in China and Russia would you have a national bank.
Yeah, only in China and Russia are national banks successful. Well, hang on. First of all, that's not right. But let's say it is. What sort of economy is China, by the way? Is it like a failing economy, or is it? Hang on. Is it the most spectacularly successful economy of the last 30 years in the world, and its rise is unprecedented in history? Hello, and fueled by state banks. Let me assure you, we've documented the role of state banks in China. It was such an own goal by her. It was hilarious. What she was trying to do was just dismiss, by naming those two countries, just dismiss it as almost an authoritarian idea, right? And nothing could be further from the truth. And of course, that's where she's a traitor to her own party, because Labor was the party of a national bank in Australia. That's the whole history of it. And what you referred, the part with the NAB. I refer people back to your show, Martin, back in June, because that's, you've played the footage then of Rachel Slade from NAB saying, in terms of visits to the bank that don't involve result in transactions, they're very difficult to measure. We don't measure them. That's what she said. And I know when you're in like with your show, see, I'll reveal something to the viewer. What you're seeing, what the viewer's seeing when they're watching this show, Martin, is different than I'm seeing, because you've got controls there, and you're showing me on the screen when it's when me talking, and then when you're talking, you're showing us on screen. So what you're seeing from a Senate hearing is very similar, because I'm in the room, I'm seeing the whole feed from the NAB headquarters, and not what you're seeing on the camera, right, over the internet. And so when this came up. Because Linda White went after them over it. And then Jared Rennick quoted Rachel Slade by name. At first, NAB had tried to pretend it wasn't said. Ross McEwen, who had been sitting beside Rachel Slade back in June, said, "Oh, whoever said that was wrong." I mean, you were there when it happened, mate. And so when Jared Bennett quoted her, I'm watching them. You should have seen the three of those NAB execs. They're scrambling like crazy in the room. They're shuffling papers back and forth. They're trying to figure out. But they had clearly wargamed that. They were in damage control on that issue before they started, right? Because they had let the cat out of the bag. And now the senators learned something fundamental from that, and they're not backing off. They know that the banks are lying about their reasons for closing branches.
Absolutely. And, this is a very, very important and developing situation. So I'll be watching out for the next hearings as they come up. I think there's more to talk about in terms of the contextual developments here because, of course, you've got the cash question, and will cash continue to be critical? The good news is they've pretty much committed to keeping cash in the system as far as I could hear, which was great. And then the other thing that I'm still concerned about in the background is the central bank digital currency and the digitalisation of money, and the importance of making sure that doesn't get out of control. So in a way, this is the sort of the tip of the iceberg, right? Because it is actually about the future of the financial system in Australia, the future of banking, and the future actually also of regional communities across the country. And that's why this is such a big deal.
Yep. And we were motivated by all that. We got this inquiry up, and I think it's just gone from strength to strength. And this week was the pinnacle of it so far. Don't know where it can go from here if it's going to get better. I mean, there's always good stuff that come out of it. But it all started with concerned communities, engaging with people like us who had a sense of how we can get this raised to the parliamentarians, and then good parliamentarians taking it up and championing it to the point, okay, let's get an inquiry, and then the inquiry totally unmasking the banks in the process. And so, look, always stay engaged, people. Stay engaged in the political process, right? If you're someone who helped make phone calls, made submissions to the inquiry as we called for, pat on the back, stay engaged, and always do that when we put out the call. It's worthwhile, absolutely worthwhile. And I can just assure you, I've never been happier with an inquiry than this one. I think it's going gangbusters, and it's this could be the thing that finally starts to tip the scales of power back in the people's favour.
Absolutely. And, it isn't too late if people have strong views about this to speak to their own politicians and make sure that they understand how important this is, or indeed the local councils, right? Because other councils have not been so proactive as Junie in terms of trying to actually drive this. The more that we can get community engagement and participation, the roots and branch up from the bottom rather than top down, the more this will actually take us in the right direction. So, Robbie, I want to say thank you to you. You've been there on the front line, as it were, as well. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us, and we'll keep everybody updated. More, of course, coming on this over the next few weeks and months. A really critical battle, but a really important week, and a very positive week.
Yep. And stay tuned, people. More good stuff to come.
Absolutely. Thanks, Robbie. See you later.
Thanks, Martin.